Hello, this is Kyle, also known as Alien Dude. Today, taking a look at this Chen Double Dragon Swede Dao. Now, this sword does not belong to me. It is part of a group of swords that Chen's representative KK had sent to me to be loaned so I can do these videos on them. I am taking way too much time to get these done, but time is perennially in short supply, so I squeeze them in when I can. I believe I have 2 models left to do. This sword retails new from Chen's website for $370 plus $70 shipping to the US. This specific one has a $30 African Blackwood scabbard upgrade. You can also order this sword from Kult of Athena. They have them in stock without that upgrade, and their price is $448 before tax or shipping. So a little bit more expensive from Kult of Athena, but you'll end up getting it quicker and not have to worry about international shipping. And I've put links in the description to both of those. Just as always, any link to Kult of Athena from me will include my affiliate code, so I do get a minor kickback if you buy something through one of those links. Now, like I said, this isn't my sword, so I do have to send it back to Chen or wherever they want me to send it after this video, or after all my videos with them are done. Now, as a consequence of these swords being through multiple people's hands and shipped a bunch of times, oftentimes they have little bits of signs of wear and use, and this sword is no exception. The guard is very slightly loose, and then this brass washer on the scabbard comes off very easily, as you can see there. So this isn't really a problem per se, but it's why I'm not doing full reviews of these swords, because they all have seen enough use, and frankly, shipping swords after a few times ends up oftentimes being abusive. So they're not really pristine enough for what I consider to be appropriate review. So instead I'm doing these kind of informal showcases of the swords. So this video is going to be broken down into a few sections. We're going to have a visual overview of the sword, then we'll talk about the history of it, and then get into how it handles and cuts. So let's start with the scabbard here. This African Blackwood upgrade looks really nice in my opinion. It matches the grip color, and I like the way that looks. And also, just the scabbard as a whole is really attractive. That dark color, I think these are actually bronze, not brass, and it's very slender. It's a really nice looking scabbard. It has these suspension rings on it for if you want to wear it. And if we hold those rings and shake it, there's only a tiny bit of rattle there. And if I hold it upside down, it doesn't come out easily, but then this time it's not. Usually it actually slides out pretty easily, and usually like that. I can hold the grip and it'll slide out. But that's not really a problem because it's still pretty well secured in there. Moving on to the sword itself, the hilt is very striking. It's got this very elaborate pommel. It's kind of what it is. It's basically one of the very typical Chinese ring pommels, except that it is incredibly more elaborate with double dragon on here. And then it's got kind of like a butt cap there. It's got 2 rivets through, along with these little floral rivet blocks. I'm not sure what to call them. And then right here, there is a tassel attached to a ring in there, so you can use the tassel to keep the sword in your, wrap it around your wrist and keep the sword in your hand better. It's got a very simple guard. Like I said, it is very slightly loose. And when I say simple, I don't really mean simple. I mean small. It's a small guard, but it's still bigger than some of the other ones that you'll see on Chinese swords. And it does a good job of stopping the hand from sliding up the blade, which is something a lot of Chinese Dao, and especially earlier ones, didn't really do much of anything like that. It was actually very easy to have your hand slide right up the blade and then start gripping the blade and probably cutting the hell out of yourself. Now, overall, the hilt, like I said, is very, very striking. This is a little bit weird, but we'll get into how to use the sword with this, at least how I used the sword to account for this, because normally this is pretty much, it's not quite dead center on the grip, but it's close. And normally that would be where I'd want to grip the sword. But we'll get into that more during cutting and handling section. You've got a blade collar here. This in a Japanese sword would be called a habaki. I think it might be a tunkao in Chinese on Chinese swords, but do not quote me on that. And then you've got the blade. It is a straight dowel with a curved tip and a pretty short primary bevel on here. It's mostly even thickness from the spine to this bevel, and then it bevels into the edge. This is not a secondary bevel, it is the primary bevel, and it is brought to the edge quite nicely. It is apple seated, so there is some, in Japanese terms, there's some niku there. The blade itself is made of the pattern welded steel that LK Chen offers on most of their swords. And again, like pretty much all their swords, it's a really nice pattern without being too bright and obnoxious. If I run my fingers along the surface of the blade or along the spine, I feel very, very minor rippling, but very, very minor. This is considerably less than you will normally find on an LK Chen sword, so this is a good example of what they're capable of doing. It's overall a very striking sword. Even though it's quite simple in design, there's something very purpose-built about the look of it. It looks like it's purpose-built both for cutting and for thrusting, because that straight blade means you can get the point in line with your wrist and deliver the sword, deliver the point where you want it to. With curved blades, it can be a little bit harder than that, a little bit harder to do that. If we look at the spine, there is some distal taper here, but not a crazy amount. It starts decently thick and has some gentle taper throughout. Ending definitely looks to me like about 50%, no, more like 30 to 40% distal taper, somewhere around there. It works out quite nicely. It is balanced right around there. That's like, from the end of the tunkao, about 3.5, 4 inches, right around there. Moving on from the visual inspection, let's talk about the history of this sword and what was going on in China around the time this sword probably would have been used. And for that, let's welcome back my friend.
Thanks, Kyle, so much for having me back on the channel. So we're talking about the Clarence Mackey Double Dragon Sui Dao, which is a sword based on a specific museum example coming from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Now, it's listed as a sword that comes from the Sui dynasty of China. And so let's do a very quick background as to what's going on in the history of China at this time. You'll remember, perhaps, that there was a very turbulent period of China's history where we talk about the northern and southern dynasties, where we had many, many dynastic periods of turnover where China was separated between northern China and southern China. Southern China had a little bit more stability, where there was turnover between dynastic periods via mostly assassination, and northern China underwent a significant amount of hostile takeover via warring barbarian led tribes. Eventually, this gets consolidated right around the turn of the 7th century AD by the Sui dynasty. This grows out of the Western Zhou dynasty. So the first emperor of the Sui dynasty grew up in Western Zhou and formed the Sui dynasty, which was actually relatively short-lived. So although they managed to have 3 emperors packed into the Sui dynasty, it only lasted about 37 years and was eventually supplanted by the Tang, which is considered one of the golden ages of China's history, and it lasted much longer. It lasted almost 300 years altogether before eventually succumbing to the Song dynasty. So this is the period which we're going to look at. So if you look up the website, it dates this Dao as coming from around 600 AD, which does fall in that kind of narrow window of the period of time where the Sui dynasty exists. Is that the case? Well, it's a little hard to tell just based on what we have. It was found in Hunan, China, which is kind of central China, in a tomb, but it didn't have any sort of other associated artifacts that could date it. So by the time it got into a collector's hands and eventually into the Metropolitan Museum of Art, we can compare it to other Sui findings and find that, yes, indeed, the other, let's say, artwork or figurines we have from the Sui do have swords of this type, Dao, that have intricate figurines at the end. But where does this come from? Let's take a look specifically at the dragon on the ring pommel that we have. Remember how I mentioned that the first emperor of the Sui came from the Western Zhou, and they built their military structure based on the way that the military was set up in the Western Zhou dynasty. And we actually have some recorded accounts as to how the Dao were structured in the Western Zhou, and this carried over into the Sui dynasty. Let's take a look at one of those accounts real fast. So, from the Book of Sui, 1612 AD, it records the system of guards in the Northern Zhou dynasty from 1557 to 1881 AD. The Northern Zhou established the official post of commander on the left and right palace guards. The commanders were in charge of the protection of the palace. They both wear golden armor, and each holds dragon ring long dao. The dao was gilded with gold. The central residence guards are all in golden armor. The left guard holds the dragon ring long dao. The right holds mythic beast ring long dao. The dao was gilded with gold. Next is the left and right attendant guards. The left holds phoenix ring long dao. The right holds a unicorn ring long dao. Next is the left and right forward attendants guards. The left holds a lion ring long dao. The right holds an elephant ring long dao. And it's important to note that for military matters, the left position is more senior than the right. So we can see from this account that during the 6th century, they had already established that these ring pommels with fantastic creatures inside of them had specific designations and were in use during the Western Zhou dynasty, and they had been adopted into the Sui dynasty. And there was a hierarchy to them. There was a specific order. So depending on how important you were as a guard, depended on what type of creature you could have in your guard. So, or in your pommel rather. This was used in the Western Zhou. It continued to be used in the Sui dynasty, and we have artifacts. We have Dao that have been discovered recently, certainly since the original find in the Metropolitan Museum was discovered in the 1920s, from the Tang dynasty that look the same, that use the same shape of ring pommels. So this was a tradition that spanned at least 3 dynastic periods. That makes dating this specific example reasonably difficult. Right now, LK Chen is still listing it as a Sui period sword, and it certainly could be, but we don't have enough evidence to positively identify this as a Sui specific sword. A few other interesting features about it. The original had the blade inside of it completely rusted away, so we don't know exactly the geometry that it had. It's been reproduced using other examples of sword blades from the period. For instance, the tips on some of these sword blades have a chisel tip, others have a more gradual rounded tip to it, which is the way that it's been reproduced. It has the ringside suspension on it that is typical of these types of hang dao, these type of horizontal dao from the period. This is a facet that was adopted of Central Asian design. So examples that you can see, for instance, in Sanasid and Sarmatian period swords. This is a Tang, the LK Chen Tang hang dao, and it doesn't have the ring pommel design on it. But another interesting feature that is something that requires a little bit of adaptation is it has a tassel on the side, and it's mounted through the middle of the grip. And everyone might say initially, is that a mistake? It's not a mistake. That is how the original is done. So through one of the rivets that's holding the handle in place, it has an external attachment point, and then from that a lanyard is, or a tassel is attached. And this is another feature that we find on Central Asian swords. So an example here in the Mongolian Dao has that done all the way on the pommel cap, but we see it time and time again done through even the handle rivets. And this is a case where we don't have any example of how they were used in periods. So it seems kind of counterintuitive that right where you'd want to place your hand, they have this kind of extra little ring and the lanyard coming out. And this is a place where experimental archaeology will have to come into place. So as we get these swords in hand and we figure out how you're able to hold them, we can see how these Central Asian, Chinese, and in some cases even Japanese swords from this period of around the 6th to 8th century, how they all can be adapted to be used despite having a kind of unusual placement of the lanyard string. Anyway, back to you, Kyle.
Thanks for that, Andy. Always a pleasure to have you on. So that's pretty much the history of the sword and its inspiration and what was going on in China when it would have been used. Let's move on to something completely divorced from that, and that's how I used it, which is, of course, cutting water bottles in the backyard. Now, first thing I want to talk about is this pommel. I would feel most comfortable holding the sword right around here. I said pommel there. I meant this ring and rivet. I would feel like, just especially visually, you'd want to wrap your hand right in between those two rivets, right? Well, I find it works better to wrap it up like right there, butting right up against the guard. And actually the guard, the way it flares there, it actually nestles against the fingers pretty nicely. I will say these little floral decorations, they do rub against the fingers a little bit uncomfortably. That wasn't a problem when I wore a glove, but when I didn't wear a glove, it was a bit of a problem. So how does this sword cut? Pretty dang well. It is sharp enough to do the job, not crazy sharp, but again, this has been through multiple YouTubers and reviewers and such, so who knows how much use and possibly even abuse the edge has seen. But it does backyard cutting pretty well. The big concern, and this isn't really a concern, but my biggest issue with the sword is that the grip is a little slender for me and slick because it is wood. And then if you look here, it's not very thick and it's wide. I found, especially when I was doing, well, this is the wrong term for Chinese swords, but it's the terminology I know, Unterhaus, where you're, a cut from below, or Mittelhaus, a cut from the side. What I found is that I didn't have as good of a grip on the sword as I wanted to. And it felt like it could turn in my hand. You can see here, it doesn't turn all the way, but it does kind of give a little bit of loosey-goosey in my hand, a little bit. And I never felt like I had a fully secure grip on the sword. Wearing the tassel, wrapping it around my wrist probably would have helped a little bit, but that's more, I don't think that would have helped really lock the grip in my hand, because that's more about, keeping it nice, your hand locked in place, but not so much the sword locked in my hand, at least how I understand it. So I didn't do a lot of cutting with it because I didn't feel like I had a good enough grip on it. This is my taste, though, because I am sure there are people that this grip is perfectly shaped for. It's just not shaped that way for me. But overall, this sword is still pretty fun to move around. It's quick, it's agile, it has a good balance between thrusting and cutting, and I go to do two hands on this sometimes just because the grip is long enough. It's not intended for two-handed use. I didn't actually do any cutting two-handed, but when I just go to pick it up, I want to go grab it in two hands because that grip is long enough. But again, not intended for that. One thing I will do two hands for is to show the sword wind, though. I find it a little easier to demonstrate that using two hands than one hand. So it's easy to move around. It's easy to put the tip where I want it to. You can, there I go again. You can start a cut and then redirect it very easily. So overall, it's a fun sword to use. I would like using it a lot more if the grip were a little bit more secure in my hand. And this was with both barehanded and with a glove. Neither of them felt fully secure to me. Now, one interesting thing that happened when I was cutting is I was not gripping with this ring in my hand, but at some point it came off. I'm not sure exactly when it did, but it was pretty easy to just squeeze it back on there. All right, so this sword retails for $440 from LK Chen, including shipping, or $470 with this African Blackwood upgrade, which, by the way, absolutely worth it. That upgrade is definitely a nice touch. I really like the look of it. Is the sword worth that price overall? I think probably yes. While the handling is actually excellent. I really enjoy the way it handles. While the grip is not quite right for me, I don't think it's such a problem that if it fits you, it's going to work very well. And I love the aesthetics of this sword. This is one of the best looking swords that I've seen from LK Chen. I love the bronze work, the cast double dragon pommel. It's just a gorgeous sword, very striking, and I really do like the sword overall. I just wish I could get a better grip on the handle. And that's going to wrap up this video. A huge thank you to KK for sending this sword and others to me. I am doing my best to get these videos done. I will try to get it done faster. I'm so sorry for holding on to these for so long. For everybody else, if you like this video, make sure you hit the like button, leave a comment, subscribe if you haven't. Do all those things. YouTube wants you to do them. And if you like this sword, check out LK Chen's work. Until next time, Alien Dude out.